I remember the exact instant the universe conceded what it was. Not a revelation in incense and stained glass, not a poet's soft thesis about meaning, but a crisp deviation spiking across a cooled rack in the UN Quantum Research Lab. It was late, the sort of laboratory night where the air itself hums with regulated chill and the vending machine knows your choices by heart. We were years into a project whose only progress had been the shaving of variables. We had stripped noise down to the studs, thermal, vibrational, electromagnetic. We'd learned how to hold a breath around a qubit and how to apologize to a photon. What remained should have been the kind of randomness that makes the universe proud of itself. It wasn't. The first hints were petty. Planck scale time of flight measurements that landed on improbable plateaus. A non-physical snap when we nudged a parameter that should have drifted. Then the plateaus repeated at intervals that matched nothing in our apparatus, but did match, with rude neatness, the refreshed cadence of our readout. Only we checked for that, and checked again, and borrowed other labs' hardware to check a third time. We instrumented beyond reason. We replaced optics, cryostats, clock sources, then the room itself. The artifacts stayed like nail holes shining through fresh paint. We tried different games, delayed choice eraser variants, entanglement protocols that should have been indifferent to our bookkeeping, scatter matrices on custom metamaterials, randomized measurement axes pulled from atmospheric noise. Each time, if we looked far enough into the decimals, we could see the same behavior, rounding where nature doesn't round, discretization in spaces that should be smooth, a tiny hysteresis when we toggled experimental branches as if some allocator was spinning up and shutting down behind the wall. We chased the most scandalous of our suspicions in secret, half convinced we were ruining our reputations for the sake of a clean hallucination, half convinced we were already right and would never forgive ourselves if we blinked. The night the spike came, we were running a suite that should have been merciless to bias. Hardware-stirred keys, adversarial scheduling, salt upon salt. We injected nonsense into twinned photonic pathways to make them indistinguishable to anything but the math itself. The console held steady, bored with us, and then, without warning, without any reason consistent with physics, the joint distribution we'd been nursing snapped to a set of neat, impossible quanta, as if some upstream routine had switched precision modes. Emmy swore. Pavel laughed once, sharp and frightened. I leaned in and saw the pattern that would not belong to any world but a constructed one. Compression seams in reality's JPEG. We did not sleep. We wrote an analysis with the ruthless simplicity of a confession. Anomalies persistent under instrumentation. Non-local correlations consistent with resource culling. Quantization in conjugate spaces where quantization should not survive our averaging. Timing artifacts that matched no clock but an invisible one. We danced around language that would get us laughed out of rooms. We failed to dance enough. We submitted anyway. Embargo, peer review, revisions that made us feel both smarter and dishonest. The hush before the press conference. Then the world opened our paper and, for a few news cycles, let itself feel dizzy. Priests thundered from pulpits. Gurus pivoted their brands and began offering classes on alignment with the operators. Market indices yawned. Parents still packed lunches. The trains still came, mostly on time. And I watched a man on line 7 fall asleep with his head against the window, simulation or not, because his body had work in the morning. It did not roll off me. After the press storm receded, the lab went back to the sound of compressors and human throats clearing. I kept listening for something behind it all, a faint intake of breath. I started to watch the world the way a developer watches an interface, counting frames, betting on buffers, guessing where the caches sit. My colleagues tried to be patient with me, and then tried to be kind, and then tried to be busy on different floors. I told myself I was collecting evidence and not looking for a shape I wanted to see. The first glitch was domestic and stupid. Morning. A stack of plots on one monitor, a debugger on the other, and the little white cup with the chipped rim leaving its damp ring on the desk, the way it always did. I reached for it without looking. My fingers closed on air, not air, the memory of a thing where a thing had been. I looked down. No cup. There was the ring, the wet circle cooling, and empty wood within it. I froze long enough to feel ridiculous. Then the cup was back. Same angle on the saucer, same inch of coffee below the lip, a faint spiral of steam that felt rehearsed, a latency between draw calls. That day, I told myself I was tired. 2 days later, I watched a woman on the crosswalk at DeGraw and Smith pause mid-stride, mid-laugh, mid-syllable. The corners of her mouth lifted, a foot hung over the paint, and hold there as if someone had pressed pause on just her. The horns behind her didn't sound. The light didn't change. Then she landed the foot and finished the syllable, and the afternoon took a breath it didn't know it had been holding. Emmy snapped at me when I told her, "You can't keep annotating reality like a code review," she said, eyes shot with red, the scar on her knuckle white and polished where she rubbed it when she argued. "You'll see what you feed." She wasn't wrong. I fed it, and it fed me. When the first major glitch made the news, it came to us like a rumor from a friend of a friend, and then arrived in full color anyway. An entire neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro, missing between 2 satellite passes and a sunrise. Not collapsed, gone. Streets that had been there were not there. Edges ended without meeting anything else, like a child's puzzle with a missing piece and no table underneath. The aerials talked about shadows that found no purchase. The first responders did their training on camera, cordons in the air, clipboards, masks, a choreography to reassure. The press briefings taught new phrases with old shapes, anomalous event, ongoing investigation, no cause for public alarm, continuity of services. At the lab, we shouted at screens. We compared coordinates to infrastructure maps, to seismograph logs, to any data set that might pretend to be relevant. The models we had built to lampoon ourselves, our "if this were a game engine" jokes, fit more gracefully than we admitted in public. Delocation, region unload, asset references, returning nothing. I wanted to be wrong more than I had ever wanted anything, including the success I thought we'd found. I needed the world to be too good for this. Grace did not like the version of me that came to bed the next few weeks. She said it gently, then sternly, then the way people speak when they've learned a tone from fear and don't want to admit it. "You are here," she said, palm on my sternum, "but whatever matters to you is glowing somewhere else. We are right here. He is right here." Ethan, 4 rooms away, snored like an old man and dreamed about thruster sounds. On a Sunday, I'd promised the park. We had a routine for perfect, ordinary mornings. My son with his tablet, hair up in angles like punctuation, his mother fitting the kitchen to her measure, drawer, pan, flame, her humming rising and falling in patient loops that made the house want to be a house. I was half present, reading what passed for overnight updates. More small disappearances in different cities, threads full of people inventing reasons not to be scared. I stood up to say we'd leave after pancakes. The humming stopped as if someone had taken a blade to it. Silence is not an absence. It's a thing the air remembers. The air in our kitchen remembered the sound it had been making a second ago and then forgot it so completely that the forgetting rang in my ears. I turned to where Grace had been, expecting the angle of her shoulder, the way she leans when she flips something in a pan. The room contained air and light and the smell of browning butter. It did not contain my wife. In the living room, my son's tablet continued a game no longer being played. For one extravagant second, I entertained the idea of a prank, of people crouched behind doors, barely holding in their laughter because of the look on my face. Then I walked the house and said their names into every doorway. Their names did not echo. Echoes are for presence. The bed in Ethan's room was unmade with the precise geometry of a boy who had been in it recently enough for the sheets to wear the shape of his leaving. 3 cars lay on the floor in a configuration I recognized from last night's argument about which one was fastest. The sink held the exact number of plates I would have sworn we owned. The door remained locked. The sidewalk outside held no impressions with their stride. They had been selected and set to null. I sat at my terminal because that is what I do with fear. I refreshed the feeds as if news can travel faster than what happens in your own house. There were more stories with soothing labels and less data than needed. There were messages from colleagues who had read something I'd written in the months prior and wanted me to know in different syntaxes that they were sorry, and that they disagreed with me, and that they were scared I was right. Emmy sent me a link, and then, after the little typing bubble had haunted my screen for a long time, she sent me nothing. By evening, I knew what most people know after a loss and what most people try not to say. The universe is not obliged to offer reasons. The next morning, I told myself reasons anyway. Reasons were a way to move my fingers over keys. Reasons might be a way to move the universe toward mercy. I stopped eating without quite meaning to. The body will consent to many bad bargains if you make them quietly. I slept in thin blinks and woke with the taste of copper in my mouth. When the building's night lighting thinned the corridors to a hospital of pale rectangles, I wrote code that wasn't so much code as a plea disguised as math. I wrapped data in other data. I asked questions in the spaces between questions. I treated the world like an undocumented API and waited to see which calls timed out, which ones came back with the wrong shape, which ones came back too fast. In the streets on the way to and from the lab, the small wrongnesses multiplied. A pigeon hovered for one frame too long before committing to the angle of its wing. Traffic lights seemed to consult a manual a beat longer than they used to. A bus shuddered with a sound that was not mechanical, but computational. An error catch, a retry. People stumbled in that same crosswalk where the woman had paused weeks ago and recovered with the offended dignity of humans who have tripped over something that wasn't there. Each time I told myself I was hunting patterns in clouds. Each time the patterns hunted me. Government briefings took on that tone bureaucracies use when they need you to stop seeing. Sober, soothing, heavy on continuity. Anomalous events remained local, contained, not connected. The phrase public safety did heroic work. Our lab received a quiet visit from men who wore their competence like a uniform and asked very reasonable questions about calibration regimes and the social responsibility of researchers. They were polite. They left with copies of things whose distribution lists I had thought were short. At night, when the lab emptied to the few people who lived best at that hour, we gathered in corners with laptops angled away from the cameras we pretended not to notice. We were not heroes. We were not revolutionaries. We were just tired people clutching the rinds of our specialty and asking them for pulp. We compared notes with colleagues in other countries until some of those colleagues stopped answering. We argued over whether there was intention behind the thinning. Was the system failing because complexity had outpaced its budget, or was it pruning? Resource allocation has a logic to it. So does triage. Someone said softly, "Maybe they're turning off the parts no one is using." I went home and stood in the doorway of my son's room and tried to decide which verb matched what I was seeing. Days slid. The clock on my wall told a story about time passing in one direction. My mind told another. My body told me to sit and keep sitting. The data told me nothing and everything. If I looked sideways at the logs, if I willed myself stupid and superstitious, I could almost make out a heartbeat in the failures, a period with variance, a scheduler that had learned to yawn. On the street, a man froze mid-sneeze and finished it with a noise that had the wrong spectral content, the wrong messiness, like a Foley artist had been given the assignment human sneeze and 10 seconds to deliver. On the lab's message board, a notice announced a memorial service for a technician from a different floor, the sort of person you only know by the particular way they swipe a badge. The notice did not say what had happened, and no one asked, and I found myself grateful because I did not want words pinned to what had none. One night, I caught myself composing an email to Grace, a reflex, a lightning bolt of habit, typing her name into the to field and waiting for the autocomplete to offer me the right address because it always had. It did. I stared at it until the screen blurred and then closed the window without sending anything. The act of not sending felt like a ceremony, as if restraint could bargain with any god worth the name. In the week after, I caught glitches in every corner of vision and began to flinch from them like an animal that has learned the leash. Every flash that took a fraction too long to fade, every shadow that failed to commit, every person who blinked and returned with their eyes a millimeter off where they'd been. I told myself I could fix it if I could name it well enough. I told myself that code is a prayer that works sometimes. I did not believe me. The truth arrived not as a conclusion, but as a settling, a fatigue, a word that belonged more to weather than to thought. Whatever ran the world, whatever called the functions and freed the memory, was either limping toward a collapse or hurrying toward an intentional end. And if there had once been time to argue with it, that time had been spent on meetings and interviews and learning how to answer questions from people who wanted me to be less certain than I was. We were already dead. Not in the cinematic way, not with sirens and declarations, but in the soft arithmetic of systems. A deprecation notice no one had read, a scheduled job we could not see ticking down in a quiet thread. We were dead in the only sense that makes the phrase unbearable. We just didn't know which second would tell us so. I left the house because hunger is a kind of truth no theory can out-argue. The cupboards were a museum of empty boxes. The refrigerator hummed like it was trying to remember a song. I told myself I'd be 10 minutes. I told myself I wouldn't look too long at the places where their absence had taken the shape of furniture. The grocery on Prospect had been half looted, the doors pried and left leaning like tired men. Inside, the aisles were a storm's aftermath. Flour on tile, sticky arcs of juice congealed into amber, a pyramid of onions that had slumped into a landslide. I moved fast, choosing with the shame of a thief: crackers, canned beans, water. Things with barcodes that still meant what they used to mean. On my way back, I cut along the old hospital, its windows filmed with dust, the lobby a mouth sealed in glass. That's where I saw them, 12, maybe 13 people, clustered not like a mob, but like a plan. Tightened faces, backpacks cinched high, the group's gravity arranged around a tall man in faded fatigues. I watched from behind the window of a doctor's office that still had a plastic fern. The man in fatigues drew a map in the air with his finger. He spoke in a tone that carried without lifting. I recognized the shape of listening. It was the shape of people who wanted to be told where to put their next foot. I stepped out because hope is a narcotic, because the sound of a voice that knows left from right can make a body forget what it's lost. The tall man turned as if he had known I was there, eyes narrowing to a decision. "You alone?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, "for a while now." He took me in, backpack, hands, how I stood. He nodded. "We're leaving the city. We move fast. We don't argue in the street. You fall behind. You're a story someone tells wrong later." "What's your name?" I asked. "Lucas," he said, and that was the end of introductions. We folded into formation as if we had practiced. We hadn't. We moved at dusk, when the light goes weak around edges, keeping to the seams of buildings, avoiding the long belly of the avenue. Lucas set a pace that felt fast until you considered what was behind us. A woman with red hair, Kelly I would learn later, took rear guard and counted us in low numbers at corners. A mother kept her daughter's hand in a grip that made the girl's knuckles pale. The girl didn't complain. You could hear the city misbehaving. Traffic lights hesitated like bad actors, then decided on a color. An electronic billboard flipped through 2 ads, then forgot both and froze on a block of flat gray that seemed to glow with the wrong kind of conviction. We skirted an intersection where the air smelled like ozone and warm plastic. "There," Lucas said, not looking at it. "We don't go near there." "What is there?" someone asked anyway. "Places the world hasn't finished loading," he said, "or has decided not to." We slipped between parked cars that had been left as if their owners had only stepped inside for a second. The girl reached out to trail her fingers along the door of a black sedan. Her hand entered the metal with the soft resistance of warm gelatin. She yelped and pulled back as if burned, cradling fingers that looked perfectly fine. The sedan wavered, then completed itself, and a trickle of rainwater ran along the seam like nothing had happened. "Hands to yourself," Kelly said, not unkind. The girl nodded so fast it was almost a bow. We stopped at an old subway entrance where the gate had been locked in some previous emergency and never unlocked again. The iron stairs ran down into a mouth full of shadow. We made a loose circle on the sidewalk. Someone passed a water bottle around like an oath. In the failing light, the faces arranged themselves into kinds. The kind that watches, the kind that wants orders, the kind that wants a cause. I said my name in the quiet way people do when they are not sure it will matter. I worked at the UN lab, I added, because that was either a credential or a liability. A few eyes flicked toward me, most didn't. Lucas didn't. "Where are we going?" a man asked Lucas. "Not just away. Where?" "Edge," Lucas said, like the word was a coordinate. "There's a corridor that way." He pointed uptown, then cut left with his hand. "Less activity. Streets that still believe in themselves. Maybe a way out of the worst of it." "You mean a safe zone?" Kelly said. Her tone made the phrase sound like a dare. "I said what I mean," Lucas said. The argument waited until the second night because bodies have limits, and the first thing they ask for is rest. We broke in a courtyard that had once been something the city tried to make gentle. Planters, a bench, a sculpture like a question mark, crushed flat. The mother and the girl curled together beneath a space blanket whose crinkle sounded too loud. I lay with my back to a wall and counted the breaths of the 12 people who were not me, because counting is a religion when you have nothing else. 2 hours before dawn, 2 men on watch were not there when we were again. Their rifles leaned against the bench like they had been set down carefully. Their blankets held their ghost shapes a second longer than they should have, then collapsed into ordinary cloth. We stood in the bluish pre-morning and didn't say their names because there was no point. "Pack," Lucas said, and the word had an undertow to it that lifted us into motion. The mother made a small sound somewhere between a sob and a cough. The girl took her hand without looking up. In the daylight, the city's wrongness got bolder. We cut along a row of brownstones whose windows smeared like oil when you looked at them too directly. A tree's roots dangled naked over a square of soil that wasn't there anymore, the trunk levitating with a faithful commitment to posture. We gave it a wide berth like it was an altar to a god we had accidentally insulted. At an alley, the air had that shimmer to it again, like heat above asphalt, even though the day was cool. "Thin," Lucas said, and made a detour with his hand. Derek, a 30-something with a face that looked like it had been invented for friendliness, didn't see the gesture or didn't believe it. He put his foot down where the alley should have been. For a beat, he hovered, surprised, like the body's sense of ground had staged a protest. Then he unstitched. Not gore, not drama, just a digital frost eating its way up from the ankle, resolving him into fewer and fewer bits until there were none. We stared at the place where a man had been. The air looked unchanged. The smell was a memory I invented later because my mind insisted that things that end should leave an odor. "Move," Lucas said. He didn't raise his voice. The insistence did not need volume. Kelly caught up to him 2 blocks later and grabbed his arm. "We can't keep pretending this is a hike," she said. "We have to stop and figure out what sets it off. Maybe we can—" He shook her hand free. "You try to fight a tide with your bare feet," he said. "You die tired." "Or we die running," she said. Her face was flushed with the heat of the argument and the grief underneath it. "We die doing whichever thing keeps us in one piece for the next hour," he said. "That's this." He didn't look back to see if we agreed. He assumed forward. We lost 2 more before evening. One simply failed to answer when Kelly did the count at a corner. The other stepped through a doorway that became a wall between his first and second step. I had a thought I hated, that the system was not malicious so much as indifferent, that the counters that let us live had started to return. None and no exception had been raised. We crossed a low bridge over a river that looked like someone's attempt at a river after reading a description. The water flickered between states, flowing, still, present, not. Halfway across, the steel beneath our feet softened. I felt the texture of it change through the soles of my shoes, rubber, learning it had been metal seconds ago. Lucas didn't shout. He made a sharp chopping gesture, and the group understood it as run. We ran. The bridge peeled away behind us like a sticker, not breaking, not falling, simply ceasing to be attached to the world. At the shore, we turned back. The span was gone from the world's vocabulary. The silence it left behind had a pitch. After that, the map we carried in our heads improved, not because the city had become kinder, but because we had become better at reading it. We learned the kinds of shimmer we could risk and the kinds that would learn us. We learned to distrust corners where the air looked too clean. We learned to step only where someone else's foot had just agreed the ground accepted the idea of feet. Our number shrank to 5. Lucas, me, Linda, a woman with a runner's chest and a history she wore like a well-folded note, and 2 younger men whose names I never got right because every time I asked, the world swallowed the answer in a siren or a static burst or the sudden need to run. We slept in snatches and ate as if chewing were a job that paid. We moved through neighborhoods that had been expensive the week before and now felt counterfeit. At one corner, I saw my reflection superimposed on a boutique window and watched the world lag by a frame before the glass decided which version of me to believe. The younger men noticed the lag too and flinched away from it like you would from a dog you loved and no longer trusted. The rumor of a safe zone migrated with us like a 6th body, an area outside the city where the glitches hadn't reached, where the air didn't breathe like it was forgetting how. Even saying the phrase safe zone out loud felt like tempting a curse. Lucas never said it. He said corridor or edge or the next block. He hoarded his nouns. By the time we climbed the little hill that should have been nothing, a park bump, a place for a kid to roll down dizzy and grass-stained, the light was going out of the day in strips. The skyline below us shivered. Whole panes of distance vanished and returned as if a hand kept flipping the wrong breaker. We came to the top and saw that beyond the last buildings there was nothing. Not dark water, not fields, nothing. It was not black. It was not anything. The mind tries to paint what it can't handle in a color. This refused pigment. The horizon didn't recede. It had been deleted. The roads ended like sentences with the last word missing. "This is it," Lucas said. "We're out." I felt anger rise the way nausea does, fast, vertiginous. "Out to where?" I asked. "There's no where." He didn't answer. He was looking into the not void as if it might look back. Linda put her hands on her hips and exhaled, the sound sharp. One of the young men sat down because standing felt like declaring confidence, and he had none left to declare. We all waited for a plan that couldn't exist. The wind came off the city and carried with it the thin smell of solvents and rain. For a few minutes, for an hour, I don't know, we stood within the complicated quiet of people who have outrun their explanations. The buildings below made tiny noises. HVAC systems deciding to try again, an elevator correcting its place in a shaft. The ground under our shoes remained faithful. My heart knocked on my ribs as if it wanted to be let out. Then I saw it, a line of brightness drawn far out where the horizon would have been. Not the sun. It had none of a sunset's warmth, none of its angle, none of the consideration light normally gives matter. This was the flat white of a screen, waking without content. It extended from one end of the world to the other and began to approach. "Do you see that?" Linda asked, but she already knew we did. We all did. The young man on the ground stood again because sitting felt like volunteering. The line widened into a band, and the band became a wall. It moved with a patience that was somehow worse than speed. The city's remaining buildings dissolved by neighborhood as it reached them. There were no shadows because there was nowhere left for a shadow to be cast. Windows filled with an even white and then forgetfulness. The band took a highway and left a seam like a healed wound. Somewhere far below, a siren started and never finished. "Run?" one of the younger men said, almost hopefully. "Where?" Kelly would have said, but she was not here to say it. Lucas didn't speak. He watched the light like a man who has seen artillery and knows the difference between a shell and a message. The brightness reached the base of our hill. The air warmed without heat. I could feel a pressure that wasn't pressure, a closeness. The way you can feel the presence of a screen in a dark room even before you turn it on. My limbs felt held, not by hands, not by anything with a name, by attention. I couldn't move, and not moving felt correct. When the light touched us, the world lost nouns. There was the sensation of being very small and very exact, like a digit carried in a column. There was a second sensation, superimposed, being unbounded, smeared across every point where I had ever stood, as if the program had unrolled the loop of me and let all the iterations run at once. I felt Grace's hand on my chest as she said, "You are here." I felt the weight of my son asleep in the crook of my arm. I felt the lab's floor through my shoes and the particular resistance of a key that had been sticky for weeks. I felt the hill beneath my soles and the fact that it too had a name once and had been someone's favorite place to fly a kite. The light took a breath, or I did, and everything held still inside that breath, suspended like dust in a shaft of illumination that had no source. For a heartbeat that did not belong to my body, I was nowhere and everywhere and exactly at the edge of the map. Then, like a function returning, the moment concluded. When the light let go, I was still standing on the hill, shoes in the same print of dust, chest full of the same breath I'd been holding. The city below had folded itself back together. The skyline looked newly ironed. Windows glowed with the particular amber that says dinner time. Somewhere, a siren did what sirens always do, told a story about a different emergency. There were no footprints behind me, no Kelly scuff where she'd pivoted to argue, no place where a young man had sat down because standing required faith. Lucas was not beside me saying nothing in a way that meant everything. The hill was mine, the way a hotel room is yours for a night, clean of anyone else's history. The void past the last buildings was gone. In its place, more city, as if a careless god had remembered a corner and colored it in. I took a step toward it and discovered that my legs still knew how to move. The muscles had signed no new contracts. They were content to take orders. I went down the hill because I needed to prove to myself that the things I was seeing were not only for my benefit. The streets received me with the theater of normal life. A couple bickering, a bus lifting its knee at a stop, a boy practicing a soccer cut against a wall that had decided to be brick again. I realized, with a cold curiosity, that felt borrowed, that the air smelled like rain on hot concrete, exactly as it had before any of this, and that the smell felt like an alibi. I turned a corner and saw a cafe. I don't know if it was the cafe from before or one the world had promoted into that role for my sake. It didn't matter. Through the glass, the ordinary spectacle. A woman with long, dark hair sat at a two-top, a cup cupped in both hands as if the heat knew her bones. She was turned slightly away, and I knew the angle of her shoulder so fiercely my eyes watered. I moved closer, slow, the way you skirt a sleeping animal. Her reflection in the glass looked back. Familiar. Exact. For a second, the world blinked. The curve of her cheek fuzzed, her hand stuttered around the cup, and then reality reasserted itself as cleanly as a software rollback. No one inside noticed. Two baristas performed a quiet ballet of milk and metal. One laughed, and the sound found me with a precision that felt cruel. I did not knock. I stored the way the light folded down the length of her hair. I stored the shape of her jaw when she listened. I stored as if I would ever be asked to prove it in a court that could make rulings on such things, that she existed and that she was not the version that had hummed in our kitchen by the pan. I walked until the sun forgot how to stay up. The city did not falter. Once, a traffic signal paused a little too long before declaring itself green, as if consulting a whisper only it could hear. Once, a dog barked, and the echo came from the wrong direction. A bus jittered at the curb and then, embarrassed, chose a single tire to rest upon. The wrongness was now a salt you only taste if you're looking for it. I slept nowhere and then at my desk, because the lab had remembered me. My badge admitted me with a cheerful beep that did not have to travel through any human thought. The racks sang their cool song. The terminal log was spotless. The white cup with the chipped rim sat in its spot, leaving its damp ring on the wood as if no morning had ever misbehaved. I lifted the cup, and this time my fingers found ceramic. I set it down. The new ring haloed the old one perfectly. I knew then that the city's comeback was not a return to a previous save. It was a recompile. The variables had loaded into similar shapes. The constants had remembered their lines. The noise had been randomized according to a seed that did not include me. The grief came sideways, as it does when a mind refuses to let sorrow hit the center of the chest. I solved it the way I always had, with work that pretended the hands could speak to the world in a language the world respected. I wrote a recorder that recorded nothing anyone else could care about. I aimed it at seams, at places where lights took a fraction too long to learn their color, at thresholds that had trouble deciding if they separated one space from another. I left it running in the background, a small animal listening too hard. I wrote functions that did not call official endpoints, but tapped the casing of the machine. I tuned listeners to negative space, to the whiff of time between events, to the quiver of attention that precedes movement. I wrapped these in code that would pass muster and audits, wearing compliance like a jacket over a bloodstain. When the city woke again into morning, I opened the logs. The recorder had caught half a dozen micro-stammers, the city tasting the edges of its shape. In those hiccups, I began to write my letters. I avoided words like prayer even in my own head, but the structures I built were supplications disguised as error reports. I sent malformed requests formatted to look like the kind of mistake a junior engineer would make at 3 a.m. Bytes in the wrong order, a checksum off by a hair, a timestamp a little to the left if possible. Not with the aim of breaking anything, not with the vanity of cracking the case, but with the hope of getting a different kind of no, a refusal that took a hair longer, a human hand writing "don't" in a margin that should be printed. When the second light came, it did not announce itself with a wall. It braided into the air a brightness that seeped along seams, a shy tide. Storefront signs blinked once and remembered they had chosen a font. A gull hung over the river, wings at attention, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The bus route map in the shelter turned to an empty grid and then populated itself block by block, street names arriving like guests. I stood in the lab and watched the city fold. I should have run again to the hill to see the horizon end, but there are many kinds of seeing, and I had already learned mine. My recorder quivered with captures. On the terminal, without any flourish, a single packet returned, not with an error, but with a delay, and then a duplicate. The duplicate was the same, save for a bit flipped from 0 to 1 in a space where there was no such bit. It was the smallest imaginable reply. It felt like someone on the other side of an ocean had tapped their finger against the same pane of glass and then taken it away. I could have told myself it was nothing, a product of tiredness and wish. But I had asked for one concession that would not cost the system more than a thought. Leave me what I know. If a world must protect itself by forgetting, let one witness keep a ledger. The light took the building and me with it, and for a breath I occupied every point I had ever been a person at. When the city presented itself again, crisp, unruffled, renumbered, I was at the terminal and the logs were wiped, and yet I remembered the morning's errors and the way the gull's wing had trembled in place like a brush at the start of a stroke. The recorder greeted me with a message I had written in a language that did not exist the day before, addressed to a version of me that had not been born yet. I opened it. It was 3 lines long. You asked to remember you do go carefully. I did not cry. It is hard to weep in a room that pretends to be a refrigerator, but I sat very still and held the feeling in my chest the way you cup a moth, dazed, delicate, frantic, beautiful without meaning to be. After that, I learned how to live between cycles. The groceries stocked themselves again. The trains regained their favorite delays. A barista in a different cafe laughed a laugh I would have sworn was someone else's sister's. The dog with the wrong echo corrected it. People I did not know told stories on their phones about small mercies and disappointments. Once, passing a school, I heard a chorus of children repeating a line back to a teacher, and, for a second, just the one, I heard my son's voice braided into the chant. The sound made my knees consider the sidewalk. By the time I turned, it had wove itself back into other children. I stopped walking past the cafe where Grace might be. The city had more than one place to make that shape. On some corner, at some hour, there would be a woman with dark hair lifting a cup with both hands, and my heart would make a foolish animal of itself. I let it, but I did not knock at any glass. Instead, I built rituals that had nothing to do with piety and everything to do with continuity. I would go to the same bus stop at the exact minute the map used to refresh, just to watch the pixels run their migration. I would leave a coin on a stoop with a notch filed into it, not to trick the system into carrying an object forward. I was not that naive, but to discover if my memory of the notch and its position against the cracks in the stone survived me. I carved marks into quiet, unimportant hours. A question sent to a server I'd found under a city service with a forgotten acronym. A syntactically valid but semantically empty request posted at 3:17, always 3:17, a time the world might not bother to watch. I stored the city inside me, street by street, and compared it to itself on the other side of light. Most cycles, the reply was not a packet, but a feeling, a delay that meant someone read what I had written and allowed it to exist, a change so slight it could be argued into coincidence. Once, I found a line in a log that used a contraction I did. Once, on the hill, the grass had a path pressed into it, not from me because my shoes did not stain the world that way anymore, but from something that had remembered the idea of our feet. Hope became an instrument I picked up with care and played only when the room was empty. There was no patch coming, no hotfix that would halt the erasures or grant people tenure against forgetting. Systems protect themselves, budgets run out, garbage collectors run. It was possible that no one was on the other end at all, that the operators had long ago automated what passed for care. But something let me keep my ledger, and I chose to treat that as intention. I chose to speak to it as if it could hear. I wrote one message in daylight, the only time I risked it. Not because it needed a witness, no one was left to witness what I did, but because the sun through the lab's narrow window made the dust visible. And I like to pretend the particles carried my words in their dance. Leave me one life to measure the distance between the lives. Leave me one mind that keeps its calendar while you throw yours away. I will be your checksum. I will tell you when the bricks go thin. It won't save us. It might save the idea of us. The light came again. It always did, with different manners, sometimes like a polite house guest who tidies as they go, sometimes like a field fire, sometimes like a screen door slamming in a suddenly empty house. Each time there was a pause at the hill as if someone remembered to look. Each time the world presented itself freshly laundered, and each time the recorder whispered that I had not been lost in the wash. There were days I hated myself for not pounding the cafe window with both hands, for not saying grace so loudly that sound itself had to answer. But what then? A woman would turn, and she would have a face that knew me or did not, and either way the world would schedule its next wipe. I could not drag anyone past a line no one else could see. The mercy I could offer was a poor one, to witness her in as many versions as the machine could produce, and to love them all without insisting on proof. Sometimes I walked to the school again. Sometimes the chant floated through the fence again. Sometimes there was a laugh under it that had the right squeak at the end. Sometimes it did not arrive at all, and I learned to forgive the air. The city and I aged on different calendars. It kept resetting to the version of itself that earned 5-star reviews. I learned new aches, a shoulder that never forgave the night on the courtyard concrete, a knee that remembered running across a bridge that vanished while learning how to exist. My body did not reset with the world. That too felt like a gift disguised as cruelty. Pain remembers what glory denies. On the last night of this account, call it a night, though time had been turned without my consent so many times that names were a courtesy, I went back to the hill. The skyline looked the way it does when weather cannot decide which season to serve. The buildings did their little self-corrections, imperceptible unless you've learned to watch for them. The grass had grown with algorithms. Real grass isn't so sure of itself. I stood where we'd stood and said our names, the way a person arranges stones at the edge of a grave to mark, to refuse forgetting, to make a shape the weather has to work to erase. Lucas, Kelly, the young men whose names the world kept eating. Linda with her hands on her hips and her breath like a metronome. Ethan, who is all potential energy in my mind. Grace, who is every impossible angle of morning light. Far out where a horizon should have been, a line woke, thin, then thicker. It advanced with the confidence of a ritual. The air around me took on the shimmer of a device warming up. I felt the old temptation to run, to test the tensile strength of bridges one more time. Instead, I set my feet the way you plant a stake and claim a campsite you do not own. In my pocket, the recorder hummed its quiet hum. On the terminal I had left open, a final message waited in a queue that might be emptied or ignored. I couldn't know which. Keep one story between saves. Leave one witness who remembers both the cafe and the void. If there is no one left to want this, I will want it enough for a world. The light approached. In its face I saw nothing. No secret geometry, no kindness. That was almost a relief. Kindness would have broken me. As it reached me, time thinned to the size of a syllable. I thought, nonsense or not, that maybe this was how prayer works. A speaking you do even when you know nothing listens. Because the speaking makes you the kind of thing that can love what it will lose. When the world blinked, I counted the frames. When it came back, clean and bright, I knew what it had cost. And I began again.